It started innocently enough, I thought. A jumbled $20 bill here, a missing $50 bill there. I chalked it up to my forgetfulness, perhaps to age. After all, at 45, I had too much on my mind to pay attention to minor inconsistencies in my wallet. My son, I'd say stepson, was still finding his way in the world, and my marriage to his father had always been a bit of a precarious balancing act. But I loved Marco like family, even when he slipped into brooding silence or lost his temper. In a way, I understood him. He had lost his mother too soon, and when I married his father, he must have seen me as more of an impostor than a comfort. I still remember the first time I caught him Marco, my once little boy who had turned into a tall, aloof young man of 24. I was in the kitchen, drying dishes, when I saw his silhouette looming in the hallway. He opened the door to my bedroom, and his gaze flicked to my purse. My heart ached in a way I can't explain, a heaviness settling in my chest as I watched him make his way inside. I didn't say a word. I didn't confront him. Instead, I turned away, feeling both betrayed and guilty. Guilty because I wanted to understand what brought him to this place, a place where he had to steal from his own family. It only got worse from here. I noticed Marco hanging around the bathroom door as I showered, and I got the creepy feeling like I was being watched. I caught a glimpse of his eyes through the tiny slit in the door, and a shiver ran down my spine every time. I told myself it was just a phase, that he was confused, perhaps lonely or just angry at the world. But there came a day when I couldn't ignore it any longer. One evening, my husband was staying late at work as usual. The house was quiet, and the air was filled with summer heat. I went to the bathroom to fill the tub with water, hoping to relieve some of the tension in the house. As I undressed, I again felt the unsettling sensation of being watched. This time I swung the door open and found Marco with eyes widened with shock, standing on the doorstep like a deer caught in the headlights. "Marco," I whispered, my voice shaking. He didn't answer anything, just turned on his heels and walked away. I heard the front door slam, echoing in the silence of the house. I sank to the floor, my heart pounding. My own Stepson, the boy I'd raised, the boy I loved, was watching me in a way that shattered all notions of safety and family. For days, Marco avoided me, and I did the same. My husband, oblivious to the growing chasm between us, continued to spend long hours at work. We were like actors in a play that had lost its script, moving through scenes with no clear direction and no idea how it would end. I lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying these moments over and over in my mind, wondering where I went wrong, wondering if there was a way to bridge the gap between us. I knew that if we continued down this path, the fragile threads that held our family together would eventually break, and we would be alone. One afternoon, the tension between Marco and me reached a breaking point. I found him sitting at the kitchen table with his face in his hands. He looked up when I walked in, his eyes red and his expression defeated. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice trailing off. I could see the pain written on his face, the fear in his eyes. "I don't know what's wrong with me." I wanted to scream at him, to demand answers, to make him realize the pain he'd caused. But instead, I sat down across from him, tears coming to my eyes. "Marco," I said, barely audible, "why? Why are you doing this?" He lowered his gaze, his fingers trembling as he fiddled with the edge of his shirt. "I don't know," he repeated. "It's just, I feel so lost. Ever since Dad married you, I feel like I don't belong, like I'm just some broken part that's going nowhere." His words cut me like a knife. I'd spent years trying to be a mother to him, trying to show him that he was loved, that he was part of our family, and yet here he was, drowning in his own insecurities and fears, unable to see the love that surrounded him. I reached across the table and placed my hand on his palm. "You belong to me, Marco," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "You're my son. No matter what happens, no matter what you do, I love you." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry," he whispered again. I don't want to hurt you." And in that moment, I realized it wasn't about blame or anger. This was about healing for both of us. Marco wasn't the boy I'd once known, and he wasn't the man I'd hoped he would become. He was something in between, lost in a world that gave him too many reasons to doubt himself. And I, for my part, hadn't noticed how much he needed me not as a stepmother, but as someone who truly understood him. From that day on, Marco and I began to rebuild our relationship, one conversation at a time. It wasn't easy. There were days when resentment reasserted itself, when memories of what had happened threatened to tear us apart. But gradually we found our way back to each other. He started seeing a therapist, and I began to realize that sometimes love means facing the darkness together, even if it scares you. There were times when I doubted if we could ever truly forget what had happened. Nights I cried myself to sleep, wondering if our bond had irrevocably broken. But Marco kept showing up. He would knock on my door and ask if we could talk, or offer to help me with dinner. His presence was a small but meaningful gesture that reminded me he was still here, still trying. And in those moments I saw glimpses of the boy he used to be, the boy who ran to me with a scraped knee, seeking comfort. I realized he was still here, under layers of pain and confusion. Marco's apology became more than just words. It turned into actions. He got a job, started paying me back the money he had stolen, and most importantly, he started talking openly about what had haunted him for so long. He talked about his mother, about the emptiness he felt after her death, about the anger he harbored at his father for passing away so quickly. He talked about the nights he didn't sleep, feeling like a stranger in his own home, about the jealousy that built up in him as he watched his father and I build a life together. And in turn, I was learning to forgive, not only him, but myself, for all the mistakes I'd made, for failing to see his pain. In the end, it wasn't a perfect ending. Life rarely gives such opportunities, but it was real and it was ours. A story about a mother and her son who found their way to each other, despite all the twists and turns of fate that tried to keep them apart. There were still challenges ahead, moments of doubt, moments when the past threatened to resurface, but we got through them together, and that made a huge difference. I began to notice small changes in Marco. He smiled more often, seemed lighter, as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He started making plans for the future, talking about going back to school, finding a career that would make him happy. And I supported him every step of the way, as I always had, but now with a deeper understanding of who he was and what he needed. There were times when we would sit together in the living room, watching a movie or just talking, and I would feel a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a very long time. In those moments I knew that everything was going to be okay. No matter what happened, no matter what mistakes we made, we had found our way back to each other, and that was enough. Life is messy and families are complicated, but love, in all its imperfect and imperfect forms, can endure. And for Marco and I, that love was the foundation on which we rebuilt everything that had been destroyed. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and that's what made it beautiful. The path to healing was far from linear. Setbacks happened that threatened to undo all the progress we had made. I remember one day when Marco had an unpleasant episode. He came home late, his face was pale and his demeanor was withdrawn. I realized that something was wrong. He had slipped back into darkness. He avoided my gaze, disappearing into his room. The silence in the house seemed heavy, filled with unspoken words of pain and confusion. I knew it was best not to make him speak, but it didn't stop the pain in my heart. I didn't sleep a wink that night. The hours dragged on unnoticed, and my thoughts were consumed with the fear that we were losing each other again. But to my surprise, Marco came out of his room early in the morning. His eyes were puffy and his face was flooded with tears. He sat down next to me on the couch and, without saying a word, rested his head on my shoulder. I wrapped my arms around him and held him close as he cried, his body shaking from the weight of the experience. It was then that I realized that healing is not about never giving up, but about finding the strength to get back up, to find comfort even when the pain seems insurmountable. Marco began to speak, barely audibly whispering about the fears that still haunted him, the fear of losing the people he loved, the fear that he would always be broken. I listened, silently swallowing tears, and held him tighter to me. I told him that just because he was broken didn't mean he couldn't be whole again, that we all carry pieces of ourselves that are broken, but it's love that helps us put them back together. Then he looked at me, and his eyes filled with something I hadn't seen before: hope. There were also moments of unexpected joy that reminded us both of what it means to live life to the fullest. I remember one afternoon when Marco and I decided to take a spontaneous trip. Nothing fancy. We just drove to a nearby lake that we hadn't been to in years. The wind in our hair, the music blasting from the car speakers, and Marco's laughter. It was the kind of happiness that feels like the pure, untainted past. We spent the day riding rocks, talking about dreams and fears and sharing stories that made us laugh until our sides ached. It was in these small, seemingly insignificant moments that I saw the true beauty of our journey, moments that made the whole struggle worth it. Marco's journey to finding himself took a long time, and there were bumps along the way, but he began to thrive. He enrolled in community college, taking courses that interested him: psychology, literature, art. He found solace in expressing himself through painting, something he had never done before. He would spend hours in his garage creating canvases filled with colors that reflected his emotions, sometimes dark and stormy, sometimes bright and full of life. I watched him with pride, realizing that he had finally found an outlet for all that he had held inside for so long. My husband, Marco's father, began to notice the changes as well. He began to spend more time at home, realizing that his presence mattered more than the long hours at work. It wasn't easy for him. He had always been a man who found purpose in providing, in being the breadwinner. But seeing Marco begin to blossom, seeing the bond that grew between us, he realized that what his son needed most was his love and support. The three of us started having family dinners again, sitting around the table together and talking about how our day was going. It seemed that brick by brick we were rebuilding not only our relationship with Marco, but our entire family. There were times I wondered if Marco's mom was watching, if she could see what kind of young man he was becoming. I hoped she was proud of him, proud of the way he fought his pain, the way he was learning to open his heart again. I often thought of her in the quiet moments when Marco smiled, when he showed kindness, when he talked about his dreams. It was in those moments that I felt her presence, a gentle reminder that I was not alone in my love for him, that she was with us in spirit, supporting him. Months turned into years, and Marco continued to grow, to recover, to find his place in the world. He made friends, found hobbies that brought him joy, and even started dating. The first time he brought a girl home to introduce us, I saw the nervousness in his eyes, the vulnerability he still carried inside. But I also saw pride, the pride of a young man learning to let people in, to believe he was worthy of love. And as I watched him present it to his father and me, I felt a rush of emotion, a mixture of joy and gratitude for the journey we had taken together. Life was far from perfect. There were still moments of doubt, moments when the shadows of the past crept back in. But Marco learned to face them, to ask for help when he needed it, to lean on the people who love him. And I learned that being a mother doesn't mean being perfect. It means showing up, loving unconditionally, forgiving him and myself when we stumble. One evening, as Marco and I sat on the porch looking at the stars, he turned to me and said, "Thank you for never giving up on me." His voice was steady and his eyes reflected the starlight. I smiled, my heart overflowing, and replied, "Thank you for letting me in." It was a simple exchange, but it carried the weight of everything we had been through, every tear, every moment of doubt, every small victory. It was a testament to the love that brought us here, to this place of peace and understanding. Life is messy and families are complicated, But love, in all its imperfect and imperfect forms, can endure. And for Marco and I, that love became the foundation upon which we rebuilt everything that had been destroyed. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and that's what made it beautiful. We traveled a path of pain and healing, brokenness and wholeness, finding our way back to each other despite all the challenges life threw at us. And in the end, it was love that brought us home.